this event. There we go. Second of all, this isn't just about the last couple months of licensure. This is, we hope, will really be an open discussion on, really rethinking what do we want to accomplish as a social work profession going forward, and how best can we determine that we're delivering what we say we'll deliver. I just was reading an article recently that did a look at licensure across a variety of occupations, and one of the findings was that it made no significant difference in prestige or pay, which was a little disheartening. I also had a conversation earlier today with a colleague who runs the Temple Athletic Training Department, and she was sharing that they also are looking at various exam points throughout the credentialing of athletic trainers because of concerns of bias and who gets in and who does not. So this is sort of broader than licensure, and in many ways it's broader than us. So with that, again, I welcome you. We're going to ask that everybody stay on mute while the panelists present. And then hopefully myself and Kat Carter, who will be moderating, can orchestrate a reasonably good discussion and question and answer. So with that, I want to turn us over to Deb Phillips, who is chair of the LEAD committee for ACOSA and helped organize this event.
Thank you, Cheryl. And just so that you'll know, LEAD stands for Leadership, Equity, Accountability, and Diversity. So that's our subcommittee for ACOSA. So I have the pleasure of introducing Pat Carter, our moderator. She is a PhD candidate at Catholic University in Washington, D.C. Her dissertation will explore the differences between trauma-informed discipline practices between schools with police officers and schools without police officers. So I think that's going to be really, really interesting. She teaches a social work research course at Catholic University and a critical race theory writing course at George Washington University. So she's already a very accomplished doctoral student. So thank you, Kat, so much for doing this. And I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm very, very, very thrilled to be moderating this panel. I'm going to introduce our panelists and then allow them to speak about themselves. Our panelists are Karen Chenoweth, Sunny Maguire, Liz Lightfoot, and Brit Holmberg. Karen, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, yes, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Yes, this is my 5 minutes, is that correct? Okay.
No, this is just a brief introduction, and then we'll begin our 5 minutes with the panel.
So sorry, misunderstood directions. Yeah, so I'm Karen Chenoweth. I live here in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I'm a graduate of Temple University. Hey, Als, Cheryl Hyde, hello. I'm very pleased to be here to have the opportunity to discuss. I have been working in the nonprofit sector the majority of my career, and I just recently moved into the for-profit sector. So it's a big change. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Karen. And Sunny, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you so much. My name is Sunny Maguire. My pronouns are she and her. I graduated from Hunter School of Social Work in 2011. I worked in community social work for a while. I then graduated from the William Allenson White Institute for Psychoanalysis, and then I became a psychotherapist, and then I realized I hated that. So then after that, I realized my real strength was in community work. I devised several different social working communities really focused on labor, justice, and ethics. With that, I started doing needs assessments within the community, and I realized a huge need was in these exams. I developed a prep like a prep for the communities. And I realized that there were disparities in passage rates informally and anecdotally. So then with my 5 minutes, I'll explain more about that. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Sunny. And Liz, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name's Liz Lightfoot, and I am currently at Arizona State University, where I'm the director. And I've been here for 1.5 years. And before that, I was at the University of Minnesota for 24 years. And I pretty much spent my whole time teaching the community practice concentration. And I'll talk more in my 5 minutes. But essentially, I sort of saw a sea change in what students were interested in doing when they graduate, whether they wanted to pursue the license or not. And it's really been a big change, and there's been lots of changes in attitudes about it. So that's enough about me for now.
Thank you so much, Liz. And Brit, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you for having me. It's good to be with you all. Brit Holmberg, I use he or they pronouns. I'm here in Chicago with Council of the Three Fires, Zagagung. And I've been in the social work field for about 13 years, done a lot of clinical work, and about 9 years ago, a colleague and I, Marion Malcolm, who now has her doctorate, we started a training called Becoming an Anti-Racist Social Worker. And we've been doing that training mostly in Illinois and Chicago, but some national work recently with Zoom for a number of years. And I got sort of involved with the Stop ASWB movement, and when the data dropped back in August. And so I'm here kind of representing some of the organizers at the national level and some of the work we've been doing around challenging a lot of the concerning data that was dropped by ASWB around test pass rates. So looking forward to the conversation.
Great, thank you so much, Brit. All right, and before we begin, I would just like to point out that ASWB has stated a commitment to leading change in collaboration with social communities towards assessing the systemic and institutional factors that disproportionately affect Black licensure candidates and those of other historically marginalized groups. With that being said, we're not here to speak about what has brought us to the point of these licensing issues. We're going to use this space to come up with solutions for moving forward. So I just want to make that clear. And with that, I'd like to return to the panel for each panelist to have 5 minutes to reintroduce themselves and make an introductory statement on the topic before we begin with questions. And we'll start with Karen again.
Thank you. Thanks. Yeah, so I'm someone who was born in 71, and this is a time period, and then I also was I'm a biracial person, Black and white, and then adopted into a Caucasian family. And I was afforded a suburban public school education, but it became evident very quickly I was someone who was not reading. And so from a very early age, I was marched out of my classroom to the special reading room for assistance. And it wasn't until I was in high school in the early 80s when Temple University had a program where you could have your children tested. So my parents took advantage of that, and they discovered I have a learning disability, and I was able to then access a whole bunch of additional services and tutors, and through a lot of work, I was able to get accepted into Temple University through a remedial program, and then eventually found social work. And then I was able to eventually graduate in 98 with my master's. And I'm someone who decided to try to take the licensure exam right away because I knew I needed to have that recall right there. Went in, all guns blazing, and I failed by 1 point. And that just took the wind out of my sail completely. And also, I didn't have any money. I just graduated. And to do all of that still at the time, even back then, costed a lot of money. I was able to find work in, the nonprofit sector, as I mentioned earlier. But I did notice that I was, in my opinion, underemployed. I had wanted to do things like the VA or work for the feds, and licensure just kept coming up over and over and over. I managed to have a very lush career, and I noticed that majority of my peers who were licensed would come to me for case consultations regularly. So I was respected by my peers, trusted with their consumers, but I wasn't able to then get those same positions. So it was something that has been a problem for me my entire life. I now was able to move into the profit sector, finding something that was not, licensure was not required, but is starting to raise its head again. Some of our contractors that we work with are starting to require the license. So now my job security is again in danger. Something else I wanted to make sure I mentioned and considered. Even if there's alternative ways to license people, not with an examination, such as time served, that would be wonderful. But can we think of ways of also grandfathering people like myself in, who's now are in their 50s, who haven't had clinical supervision hours tracked my entire career? Now I feel I would be in a deficit, even if there was a way to have another avenue of being licensed. So I thank everyone for the opportunity to throw out that experience.
Thank you so much, Karen. Next, Sunny, would you like to reintroduce yourself and give an introduction?
Sure. Thank you so much. My name again is Sunny Maguire. I'm an LCSW, whatever that means. I'm here in New York and Brooklyn. I go by The Ethical Dilemma on Instagram, which is really just like a lot of anti-work memes and anarchist memes, but also there's a lot of pertinent social work information there also. So the reason I'm here is because I realized, I should have realized this earlier, but my strength is in social work community and labor justice. And so I did devise the Hunter, like an informal Hunter School of Social Work alumni community, which is now like over 3,000 people. Hunter itself is one of the largest schools of social work and has the greatest number of graduates in New York, one of the largest schools, if not the largest school. So there are a lot of alumni. It's a really big community. So like I said, I did a needs assessment. What do y'all need? Like, because I want to understand the landscape better. I want to understand the field better. What are we lacking? Because, I had been through several jobs already and I was like, all these jobs are bad. These jobs are bad. They're not working with us. They're not supporting us. Like we have struggled and suffered through them. They're also kind of dangerous, not because of the client work, but because of the lack of support. So anyway, one of the things that came out of a needs assessment of the community, which I do every couple of years, is that they needed LMSW, LCSW prep, among other things. But anyway, I was like, that's not a problem. I went to hippie schools my entire education, and I was used to, instead of taking exams, I had never taken an exam. I was used to designing projects. So I was like, okay, let's design a curriculum. Let's do this. And in that, I noticed disparities in passage rates. And I was like anecdotally, this is a problem. Am I just making this up, or is this actually happening? Is this real? So what I did was I created a subset, which is like the activist wing, like the advocacy wing of the community. And like, let's brainstorm this. What we did was we ended up partnering with Stony Brook Research. We designed a survey this time last year. We disseminated the survey nationally on identity and passage rates. We got 2,000 respondents. We were coding it. for a while. And we saw out of the research exactly what we expected. We saw intersecting data points in race, class, ability, and age in disparities in passage rates. That said, like, sure, let's abolish the exam. Let's do it. That, like, in movement with that, there are still a lot of really bad social workers out there, and the field is not weeding them out. And the difference between social work and other professions is bad social workers can cause real damage. So the problem is that an exam cannot measure empathy, relationality, and problem solving through an exam. So what I have proposed, given the hippie schools I went to and the problem solving that I was learned to, how I was educated, is that I proposed a narrative evaluation designed by the community within a community board and conducted by a clinical supervisor, which is not dissimilar from what we do at work anyway, which is employment reviews. So I do see some problems with that, but I see problems with our already existing infrastructure for licensure and accreditation. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sunny. All right, Liz, would you like to reintroduce yourself and give an introductory statement, please?
Sure. Okay. Hi, everybody. Again, Liz Lightfoot, Arizona State University. And I'll start right from the front saying that I have mixed feelings about licensure for social work in general, and particularly those who do macro or community practice. I generally think it might be good for those providing direct service to have some sort of credential, licensing, or certification. And I won't go into how extremely flawed the exam is, because we're not supposed to do that, but you all know it is. But I think the primary purpose for the license is to protect the public, and it's gotten intertwined with all sorts of other issues, such as pay, promoting the profession, some of the things that we've been talking about, and that shouldn't really be the purpose of the license. I was asked the panel, I believe, because of some of the research I've done on licensing with macro practice, and I'm certainly not the expert on this. I'm one of those social work faculty who's the macro person wherever I am, and I've taught every class probably there is, from advocacy to management to policy. I was so disillusioned myself when I was getting my MSW, when I went through, I only had a management track, that I went and got a PhD in public policy instead, because I'm that sort of person. But I didn't feel at home there and ended up back in social work. So teaching for, as I said, teaching for, 25 whatever years when I was at Minnesota, I noticed the shift towards, it used to be, I'd ask the class, how many people want to get licensed? And one person would raise their hand, and then everybody would sort of say, "Fill out," to them. Then, in, teens and whatnot, it started to be more and more people raising their hand. But the reason why they were doing it was to get a job. That was the reason for doing it. It wasn't for there wasn't some change in their beliefs about the license. So, I was thinking about this, and I did a small research project about it, where we interviewed a bunch of macro practice social workers about licensure. Some of them were licensed, some of them weren't. I thought it was super interesting. But we found what you all probably know already about what macro practice social workers think about licensure, is that generally, most of the people were negative, except for a few gung-ho folks who were licensed themselves and thought we should have macro practice licenses. And there are a few states that do have macro-specific licenses. Generally, the benefits were it was about jobs, keeping the door in, keeping a foot in the door for getting a job, or getting professional credibility when you sat in a room with other people who were licensed. They thought it sort of legitimized the profession, like, oh, social work is licensed, we should be too. We didn't hear anyone talking about public protection. That wasn't even anybody's mindset. We didn't ask, we let them tell us. But the negatives were much more. So the biggest one was that it just wasn't relevant to macro practice or community practice. They didn't need them for jobs. There were people with different master's degrees or no degrees at all who were doing the same job just as well as they were, and they didn't have to go through get a license. Some of what we heard said earlier, that it didn't really give them credibility, and sometimes it actually hurt them a little bit to say they were a licensed social worker. And then, of course, the license didn't match what they were doing. They took a test and studied things that didn't have to do with what their skills and competencies they needed in the field of macro practice. The other was the process was burdensome, especially for macro practitioners who had extra burdens, because none of them had licensing paid for. They had to take extra time and pay extra for tutoring to pass this clinical exam. Even the non-clinical one is pretty much a clinical exam, and had to often pay for supervision because they didn't have supervision built in. So there's all sorts of additional costs that folks had to do, and then do continuing education, and a lot of that was irrelevant because it's geared towards the clinical folks. So anyways, generally it was sort of, people would talk about it generally using sort of a cost benefit calculation, and that's how they sort of thought it. Is it worth it? Maybe because I want to get a job and it's competitive, I might do it. But most people said they really didn't think it was worth the cost, even though they were doing it. So my personal general thoughts is it doesn't seem, and another thing, I went through in Minnesota, I went through and was looking for, did it actually protect the public? And I think I saw a few things over 10 years about macro practice social workers, but it was all about money. There wasn't anything about the unethical community organizer or anything like that. Communities weren't using that. So I'm interested in talking about the alternatives, or maybe the alternative is that macro practice social workers don't need licensing at all.
Thank you so much, Liz. And we actually will be talking about some of the problems that are specific towards macro students. So thank you for opening that discussion up. And Brit, would you like to reintroduce yourself and make an introductory statement, please?
Yes, thanks again for having me, Brit Holmberg, he or they pronouns, from becoming an anti-racist mental health clinician or social worker, and also a part of the Stop ASWB kind of national organizing core of folks. I appreciate everyone sharing so far. It's really interesting to hear the work that you're all doing, and how people are really visioning and thinking a lot about this really important profession that many of us are a part of. So I really appreciate that. And the thing that how many people have taken the exam, any of the exams? Multiple exams. You could just raise your hand. I can't see. Thumbs up. Okay. I remember when I first heard I like that was like how you got licensed, and I was just like confounded that this field, which is so kind of nuanced and so kind of like progressive and all about social justice, that like me becoming licensed or anyone else becoming licensed in our field would be sort of distilled down to like a standardized test. And I over a lot of years like got really good at taking tests, and I did pass the exam kind of narrowly, but it was so stressful, and I did not feel at all like, I remember when I first took that practice exam, just how I failed like miserably on the practice exam, and I went back and I was like, oh, this is what they're asking. Like, they don't actually want to measure like how I would actually work with a client. They just want me to know, do I know how to reference like the code of ethics? Do I know how to, do the very sort of basic tasks of the profession? And I think that we're really selling ourselves short if that's how we want to measure both our competency and and as well as like the safety of the general public. And this comes back to, I think, what Sean Ginwright says, who's a professor, Dr. Ginwright talks about how when we're in the midst of an oppressive system, one of the first things we lose is imagination. And I think that we, in an effort to become sort of legitimate as a profession, as an effort to sort of play by the rules, if you will, especially the rules of white supremacy culture, we've given up a lot to get this sort of legitimacy. And I think what we're seeing, and what Sunny spoke about, is when you talk to people who have taken this exam, people who are, and also Karen, right? Like brilliant, skilled, empathic, just like really, they understand what it is to do social work. We are gatekeeping these people out of our profession, right? And they happen to have the majority of them, right? If you look at the data, and this is the ASWB data they provided that they said they didn't have, but they had it. They've had it for over 10 years. You look at these pass rates, it's astounding, like the disparity here, folks. And to me, I think ethically and morally, as a social worker, right, when we look at our code of ethics, and it says in 6.04 that we are part of our core is, in terms of our code of ethics, is to prevent and eliminate discrimination about with regard to race, with regard to age, with regard to, like, you know, all these things, right? We can't, to do this work, we can't, I don't think that, I think it's extremely problematic if we say this is what we're about, this is who we are, and we use an exam that is clearly racist, right? That is clearly ageist, right? That has a lot of problems when it comes to creating access for people for whom English isn't their first language, right? And we need folks from all these communities to be able to do social work. So I want to just say, like, I want to pull back and say, like, we need to think creatively. We need to challenge the ways in which we have become sort of complacent in the system. And we need to think about what we want to be as a profession. If we are going to keep gatekeeping, because that's not why I got into this field, right? I got into this field for liberation, for my own liberation, but also the liberation of the communities I work in. And like, this exam is not liberating. This process is not liberating, right? And so I just invite you all to sort of dream and to imagine what we can do, what we can be as a profession, because the world very much needs people who are willing to kind of stand up and challenge these systems that are really gatekeeping and that are oppressive.
Thank you so much, Brit. I just want to thank all of our panelists for sharing. Those are very, very powerful opening statements. We appreciate you being here. So I am going to open up with the first question. You all can jump in with answers. So when ASWB released its data report on the pass rates of the licensure exam, it was broken down into various demographic characteristics, and it did reveal huge disparities where race and even age were concerned. We all know this. So the very first question is very, very broad, but very important. Is the ASWB exam racist, ageist, sexist, ableist, all the ists? And anyone can just jump in when ready.
I can speak to that. Like, yes, also like what isn't all of those things. And for the purposes of why we're here, I really want to think about more so than just what the ASWB released, because in our survey, which we devised before the ASWB released this information, it occurred to me that we really need this information when, I don't know if any of you were there, but during June 2020, there was a town hall, social work town hall, and the ASWB would not answer any questions about this specifically. And so 2 months later, I devised the committee that eventually put this together. But what we have that the ASWB doesn't have is qualitative analysis on that. And so what that means is that we have the feelings and the perspectives of those who are in these categories, which is the paper that we're writing right now. What is the experience of those in these categories? Because that was sorely missing and deliberately, intentionally missing from that report that was released in August. I think that the the statistics that they released were abysmal, and it would have, that's all I'm going to say right now, but yes.
Thank you so much. Does anyone else have anything to add?
Well, I'll jump in here. I mean, I think it's hard. I mean, I don't know who could say no, they're not. I think we're way beyond that. I did want to. So yeah, obvious. I mean, the statistics are horrible. I'm the director of a large school, the largest school in the country, and I was hoping, crossing my fingers, maybe we wouldn't have that problem. But this is throughout all schools, and I was looking through it at the top ranked schools, and they all have the same problem too. So it's throughout every school has passage rates that have these horrible disparities. One thing I was noticing, I'm a researcher, that's who I identify as a researcher, that they don't have, the board doesn't have anyone with a psychometric background reviewing the test questions. And that is something that is like the number one signal that, if you don't have people who know psychometrics, then you shouldn't be giving a test. And as I was Googling around one day, sort of surprised by this, I saw that the Association for Psychometrics, I can't remember what it's called, they don't have a licensing test. They have an hours and supervision report to become a certified psychometric evaluator. So I thought maybe we want to just maybe follow their lead.
Thank you, Liz. Does anyone else want to jump in? Britt, I see that you've placed something in the chat. Would you like to speak to that? Does that relate to the question?
Sure, yeah. So, when this data got released, there was, I think, a pretty big uproar. And so a number of us put together a survey. There's about 10 of us, and posted this. If you haven't read it, please read it. And if you feel compelled, please sign it. We have almost 10,000 people who have signed it in the last, it's like 5 months or so. I think, I just really appreciate what Sunny said. To me, the numbers are, just really awful and really, I think, tell one story. But I do think the thing that we have to keep also focusing on is the impact on people's lives, right? This isn't just about data. This is about the qualitative impact. And I cannot say how many people have reached out to me or someone from our campaign and said this, I hate this data, and also this helps explain my experience. And this has been I feel somewhat affirmed in my experience, because I really care. I study, people have spent thousands of dollars trying to pass this exam, right, to get that legitimacy. And that is just so wrong, right? Because ASWB makes money every time this happens. They have some sort of it's unbelievable, $33 million in profit that they've made off from these exams, as well as the test, the test prep and all this other stuff. And it's a whole industry. And when you hear these people who have lost jobs because of this, Karen, you talked about feeling underemployed. We see that a lot. People can't do you can't supervise necessarily, at least formally. You can't. There's all these things that people have missed. All these really great experiences that people have missed out on because we tie this back to licensure. And so again, I think we're just missing out as a field on really great people who are leaving the field or who are not able to enter the field because of the racism and, like you said, ableism and ageism and these other isms. And again, that's just, it's not okay. Maybe it's okay for accountants. I don't know. I'm not an accountant, but it is this is what our whole field is founded on it. And so it's absolutely not okay to have these kind of gatekeeping barriers to the profession.
Can I add on to that? I'm here to speak. I have so much to say. Thank you so much for the platform. And not only that, this is messing with people's lives, like Brit was saying. And it's not just people's lives, it's socioeconomic violence. When an entire population of people, whether they be of a certain age, of certain races, of certain abilities, and of certain classes, when you're saying you can't start accumulating, like earning a salary, like you can't start working, you can't start achieving status in the field, then you are messing with that entire generation of income. You're messing with that person's ability to achieve status, that person's ability to advocate for themselves, the person's ability to become a director if they want to, that person's ability to become like what they're meant to do within this, like the contribution they need to be making here. We can't measure. Regardless, I always say that social work is two things. Social work is creating relationships and using those relationships to empower our clients. And it doesn't matter whether we're working individually or in a group or in a community or on a research project, we're always doing that. But this exam doesn't allow us to measure that. We measure that among ourselves. And I think that people for whom this profession is not for, don't continue within the profession, regardless of the exam, but the exam makes it a barrier to continue within the profession if that's something they want to do. And to gatekeep entire populations racially is disgusting, immoral, unethical, and everything against what we stand for. It's not social work. And like, I want to be doing social work within this community.
I just wanted, yes, thank you. I just wanted to add on and thank you both, Britt and Sunny and Elizabeth, for all the things you've said so far. It's when reading is a barrier, a test, like a standardized test, at least for me, is the worst. The sensation is honestly frozen in headlights. Being an adult still being able to look at a page and not being able to see a word. It freezes you, it takes your breath away, and the panic sets in. So it takes a while to, relearn or remind yourself all of those techniques that your tutors taught you all those years to try to manage and navigate through. And then balancing 4 options in your head. Oh, and thank you for adding in the one, all of the above, just for funds, just is just a kind of torture. It's sadist even, at least from my perspective when I'm in it. That's the sensation you're feeling. I just recently, because I started this new job, I recently went ahead and went through the full neuropsychological examination again, because remember I mentioned I was raised in the 70s, and during the time when, we really weren't in vogue about, being disabled is, not a problem. Be your authentic self is now kish, but back then, no. So even at Temple, even though I had the ability to tell my professors I needed to take the exam outside of the classroom and things, I hid it from as many of my professors as possible. I only used it as needed. And I suffered also grade-wise because of it, I know it. And then when I got into the work world, I never told anyone. I did not want to. We're talking about the early 90s still. We hadn't had this explosion of accepting people where they are. And honestly, even to this day, when I'm in a group and I'm reading the way I read, people are, come on, it's time to go. So anywho, so I went through that new examination again because I decided I needed to tell my new employer, this is for profit, that it's different world. I needed to let them know this is what I'm dealing with, and they needed it documented. And to see that, to go through the test again, it just exposes to you exactly your deficits. and to do it now at my age with my lived experience, it was, again, it just took something, I was just like, wow, my brain just really does not work the way others do. And so, and yes, and again, as you were mentioning about the jobs, for 17 years, I worked as an advocate for seniors, and we had the whole contract to do the Medicare education. And of course, we were trained by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. So the local office was coming all the time, and they knew me. I had a relationship with all of them. I applied so many times with them, never even got through to the first callback, what have you. And I have to, what was it? Yes, no, I hadn't done, ROTC or wasn't in the, service. So I didn't have those points on my system, but I also didn't have the licensure. So I chalked it up to that. So working in the nonprofit at 40K, applying for a job at 80K, that would have been life-changing for me. So yeah, this is a serious problem, so.
Thank you so much, Karen. Thank you. I see Cheryl, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, first, I just want to do a special sort of thank you to Karen for sharing your story and your experiences, and which I can only assume have added levels of trauma to what should be, a really wonderful career. And I don't think we hear, voices like yours enough. So I really, really appreciate you being part of this. And the reason why I also wanted to come back to lifting up something that you've alluded to, and Brit also to a certain extent, and Sunny, and Liz, everybody. And that is that at the core of social work is relationships. We form relationships with our clients and their families. We form relationships with our colleagues. We form relationships with our communities that we partner with. And so one of my concerns is that that the whole licensure process is antithetical to understanding how well we do that. And it feels like it's part of a larger sort of neoliberal march of everybody is got to just take care of themselves, that relationships don't count. And that this is really abetting neoliberalism rather than collaboration. So given that, so I'd be curious as to what you thought about that. And if relationships are central, how do we determine who is good at that? And because I think Sunny raised a really important point, there are unfortunately bad practitioners out there. Also, a lot of them licensed bad practitioners. So it's not licensure that's doing the job. So I'd also be curious as to if relationships is that sort of sacred core, how do we construct ways of honoring, facilitating, and then also calling it out when it isn't done well? Go.
Thank you, Cheryl.
Yeah.
Could you maybe just repeat the question? But it was a lot there, so maybe just maybe in 2 sentences, just kind of just sort of come back to what specifically you're asking.
Yeah, sure. I get that. There was a lot there, a lot. Basically, it's if we think relationships are at the core of the profession, right? That's our fundamental, you got to get that right. And we don't think the licensure process is a good metric for understanding that. What would be? Because there are practitioners out there who are abusive, who are coercive, who are authoritarian. They violate the norm of what good relationships are. So how would we still have some gatekeeping, but around a different concept than what the license exam goes after. And Sunny, I'll pick on you first, but because I know you've sort of tried to think about different models or different ways of figuring that out.
Sure. I mean, I'm happy to keep talking about this, but I don't want to take up all the time and all the space when there are so many other like really interesting people here. But anyway, so I am a graduate of several schools, public schools that use narrative evaluation instead of grades. And that's something that I needed specifically. Like I went to very traditional schools until it was like very clear that wasn't working for me. So I went to a high school like that was social justice leaning, where I had internships instead of classes, and which is essentially what we do, right? I mean, that's something that we did in grad school. I did that in college as well. And I always had narrative evaluations. Now, I love having a narrative evaluation. You feel really good when they say something great about your work, and you feel really bad when they say something bad about your work. It's very personalized, and it really prompted me specifically, and like the people I went to high school with, the people I went to college with, the people I went to grad school with, to improve in ways that we needed to improve. That said, I recognize that there are challenges with narrative evaluation, namely subjectivity, which is, the exams claim to be objective. That's not working. So the subjectivity is a challenge. I recognize that, especially in like, the bad social workers that we're referring to when they're in positions of power. That's a big challenge. And laziness is another challenge that could come up with narrative evaluation. But I do think that like I said earlier, bad social workers cause damage. And it's funny that Brit said, we're not accountants, which was like also what I was thinking. Accountants are like, it's math, it's not relationships. Like there's a defined answer for how to perform that role. There's not a defined answer for how to perform our role. It's really personalized. Sure. So Deborah's asking, could you give specific examples of narrative evaluation so it's a bit clearer? So what I have done historically in the institutions that I was educated in is I would create a narrative evaluation of my own process and my own progress, where I feel I was weak, where I feel I was strong, where I feel I improved, where I was able to problem solve, where I used a technique. And then my supervisor would also give a narrative evaluation of where I was strong, where I was weak, where I improved, where I was able to problem solve or use a technique. Where, it's not dissimilar from like an interview where they say, which is also another thing that I do because I just love this field so much. I coach people on like how to interview. And I often say, when they ask you about your most challenging client, they're not asking you about your most challenging client. They're asking you about how you solved a problem, how you engaged. What was your relationship like? And that's what I want to know out of a narrative evaluation. What was that process like for you? What is your actual practice like? How do you do this? And are there any other questions?
Yeah, you alluded earlier to the subjective nature of that. And have you thought about any way of making it even a pinch more objective?
Sure. I have thought that if you fail people, you don't pass people, that just looks bad on your supervision. That looks bad on your agency. That looks bad on like a whole wealth of other factors. But how does it look like in an employment review? If you keep giving someone a bad employment review, how does that look for you as a supervisor? I don't know. I just think that something that I have seen with working with people on this exam and creating coursework and working with people very individually as well. I work with people in groups and also individually, is that there are people who cannot pass it. And it's not fair that there's only one way. There's only one path towards licensure, because I can tell you, this is like kind of a parallel, but I have a dynamic disability and I can't work in an office. I can't do it. And if there was no other way for me to work, I would not be able to work. But there are other ways for me to work, so I can. If there were no other way, if I couldn't pass the exam and there's no other way for me to achieve licensure, I wouldn't be able to achieve licensure. And it's not fair. It's just not fair. So there should be, I actually don't think that the exam is going to be abolished anytime soon. Like, we can work towards it. We can hope, we can whatever. But there shouldn't only be this one way that only works for a certain population, that only works for a subset of our profession that has been educationally groomed for that exam, to pass this exam. I see in the research that I conducted that largely, which is not dissimilar from other things, the haves are able to pass and the have-nots are not. It's not dissimilar from a lot of other things we see, but this is social work. So like, let's have at least a couple of options here for people for whom exams, social workers are not really known for being great at exams, for those who need other options.
Thank you so much for that, Sunny. Does anyone else have anything to add? Britt, I'm sorry, was that a hand, Britt?
Yeah, Liz, did you have something?
Oh, yeah, I was just going to say, in an alternative to that, which I think that sounds really cool. I also think that would be hard to implement, and if we were going, who's going to do that? But I think it's really cool. But other countries just have credentialing. So you pass you get your MSW, it's accredited, and then you sign up and you've got your credential, and probably the same amount. I don't know. If there's a problem, if there's a bad social worker that we're talking about, then people can file a complaint against them, and we can, do whatever we do to decide they can't be a social worker or not. And I think that that's the best model. I agree that that's not probably coming anytime soon, though there's a few states that are way ahead of some of the other states that already are doing this. So I think we can't, and I'll tell you, there are groups of deans and directors, NAD is all over it. They've set up groups in states that have enough group, that are really pushing it. It's harder for states like mine that don't have as many schools, that many different associations. But I personally would think we could just credential. We have already this whole big apparatus that is supposedly where that we have to get it, the schools have to get accredited, and you can graduate from, and then you should be able to sign up. That's my thought. And then we wouldn't have all this stress. We wouldn't have all this potential for bias. There's other biases in the school for sure, people getting in, people affording them, but any sort of licensing alternative won't solve that problem. So that would be the easy fix if I could just, do my wand and fix it.
Yeah,
So
just to
much
kind
ways.
of build on that, I think like let's just remember too that in order to become an LCSW, like you do also have to have 3,000 hours of supervised clinical work, and so that's like a long period of time. I think, to your point, Sunny, about like just getting a sense of who the person is, and are they really cut out for this field. And so I think something that, in Illinois, what we've done is there is no LSW exam anymore. Like, you can just apply to become an LSW, which has opened up like a tremendous, I think 3,000 people have become LSWs just in the past like year and a half since they did that, right? So, to Karen's point, maybe it's not the LCSW, but to be licensed, right? It's a way of recognizing like your skill and your ability, right? And it's a way people who have an LSW can bill insurance, and it does open up some new avenues professionally for sure. So I think, you know, I think that's something to think about, and to know that if someone does want to kind of proceed, then then we need to kind of think about what do these options look like. I really resonated with the idea of there being like multiple options for people, and thinking about like ways to kind of make this work. I mean, I know a number of people who have gotten PhDs, and there are exams along the way, but like to get your final PhD, you defend your dissertation, right? There's a paper, there's like a group of people who you're presenting to who pass you, right? I had a friend who was like a pediatric urologist, and after like 10 years in the field, he had to do oral exams, and it was like an all-day thing. And I'm not saying we need to do that to ourselves, but like, and then I was just reading, I haven't listened to this podcast, but Jonathan Singer on like the social work podcast is talking about the value of simulations, right? And I think this would be something like a narrative, kind of, you get some narrative feedback, but it could also be a little bit more, maybe maybe a little bit more general, right? Like there could be these sort of units or sort of things that people would have to go through, right? And you'd be able to like answer, maybe there is some sort of closed answer options, but then there's some open-ended answers about like, this is what I would do in this situation, and like if I sense maybe there was like abuse or neglect, here's how I would respond, right? And here, just to sort of show like, okay, I know how to do this, right? Or I can demonstrate skill or competency. And so I think the idea of again being really creative and imaginative about what we can do, and kind of, I think that gets back to your question about centering relationships, right? Because supervision, there's a relationship there. If there are different ways we can, I think, embed those relationships in, and maybe this is about also training and really focusing on supervision as something that we do in our field, which I think is like just so powerful, right? Like there's so much of a narrative tradition, like so much of what I learned first of all from my own therapist, but secondly through like clinical supervision, and that's a real gift. And I think if we really invest in that and resource people even more, then that becomes like a way to really support those relationships and support our profession in terms of getting where we need to be.
Thank you, Brett. I saw that Gareth Finley had a hand raised. Gareth, do you still have a question or a comment that you would like to pose?
Yes, ma'am. I'm Gareth Finley, and since we're telling stories, I'll just very briefly mention that I make my living as an exam prep tutor for the ASWB exams. I would like to find something else to do with my time. I believe that the ASWB exam should be abolished. I really like what happened in Illinois. And I would challenge the idea of gatekeeping. I think the public needs social workers, and to get social workers to the people, we need to be talking about an entry into the profession rather than a gate to keep people out of it. And I have personal experience with many, many people who are great social workers, but this exam is in their way. So it's causing real harm to social workers and to the public. So I'm really interested in focusing in on the advertised topic of this webinar and say, how do we get from where we are now to removing the social work exam as a barrier? Thanks.
So much, Gareth. Thoughts?
I'm hoping you're off the clock, Gareth. Just saying.
I'm self-employed.
Okay. And Jacqueline Mondros has a hand up.
Thank you and hi, everybody. It's been a long time. Thank you for this session. I was going to say that there isn't a scintilla of evidence that the exam makes a good social worker. No evidence. There is a lot of evidence that a social worker who reflects, who speaks the language of the people and reflects their experience, shares their experience, and that goes to Cheryl's comment about relationship building, is a more effective social worker. And I was going to make Gareth's comment about, while it's heartbreaking to hear the stories of people who don't pass the exams, it destroys their self-esteem and their careers and all of that. What it does to our communities is shameful, because no matter where you live, 80% of the people we serve are people of color or immigrants or members of BIPOC communities. Even if you're in South Dakota, even if you're in Arizona, you're serving the immigrants, the people of color, the LGBTQ community. You're not, and if we're producing 88% white social workers, they don't match the communities we serve. It's particularly now when we're in a mental health crisis, a forensic crisis, an addiction crisis, an immigration crisis. We have to argue the workforce issues, that we don't have the workforce that we need to serve the populations we serve. New York State, if any of you, or I see a few of you are New Yorkers, we've got an organization called Social Workers for Justice.org, New York. We have a legislative strategy to follow Illinois, doing away with the entry-level license. We'd be glad to share our template with any other state and give you all of our templates, all of our letters, all of our strategy, everything. So I just put our email address in the chat. Please reach out to me. I'd be glad to help in any way possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jack. And Britt, you had something to add?
Yeah, thank you, Jacqueline. I think what it comes down to is organizing. I think it's about power, and it's about identifying who has power, and how do we really push the envelope, right? And how do we get people to notice, and how do we get people to change? And so I think I appreciate what you're doing in New York. There's places all over the country. If you want to reach out to me, I can put my email in, or anyone from the sort of organizing team. There's some really, really phenomenal people, a lot on like social media, like on Twitter and that kind of stuff. And some of them are on this call. So it's good to see you, familiar faces. But I mean, I think there's like a multi-pronged approach here, right? I think what we've realized is we can't really target ASWB in some ways because they're so big and they're sort of so embedded. So we really are looking at like how to sort of organize at the state level, in terms of how to change the law, right? Because like there's laws that are creating these licensure requirements, and if you change the law, then that changes the system. So we're meeting with legislators here. I know Maryland is doing great work, and New York, and there's other states. I think Michigan just came out with something that they're changing, Rhode Island, right? So there's that piece, and then I think there's challenging your state chapter, right? A lot of those people get elected, right? And so get involved with elections in your local, in your statewide chapters, right? And push the issue, show up to events and say like, what are you doing about this? This is unacceptable. And then, my sense is there's probably also a legal avenue here that needs to be taken, because to me, there is just like Karen shared, just like other people, Sunny was sharing about like the impact on people's lives. Like to me, this is like it's a class action suit waiting to happen, right? We just need to, I think we need to help people get plugged in and find legal counsel to make sure that that they have an avenue to say, like, ASWB, this has to stop. Like, legally, you cannot keep doing this. And until that happens, they're gonna treat, they're gonna have all these listening sessions that they want, but they're gonna try to stay in business. So if they're not making money, or if they're losing money, then they're gonna change their tune, because they're gonna have to, right? So, I'm a licensed CEU provider. I refuse to do anything for ASWB, right? And you can do that too. You can become licensed to your state or a different state and provide CEUs, right? We got to cut them out of this and refuse to allow them to profit from these really problematic dynamics. So I think the organizing, again, and this comes back to your conversation or question about relationships. We have to build relationships, right? No one's going to do this for us. We have to do this together, and we have to keep showing up. And I know there's great organizations doing this, so we just got to keep doing these types of things and get plugged in with one another.
I was going to sort of say the same thing, and thanks, Jackie, for putting in your talking about your stuff going on in New York, that there are a lot of different organizations working on this. And I was looking through the folks, and I'm worried a little bit that we're all operating on our own and not collaborating with each other. I know some are, but it took a while for some of our major national organizations who are both had task force on this to meet, so I think we do need to up the relationships on this. And really the target isn't ASWB, they're just the supplier. The target is the states. And it does have to be, this is a state issue, and it does have to be every state. And so that's, it's great. And I think it's different dynamics, and we need to realize it, whether you're in a blue state or a red state, or how long you've had licensing or not, that there's different issues. And that's what people in the states can figure out and sort of learn from what's happened in other places and sort of adapt it to what will work in your own state, because it is very different as a new purple state resident. I can tell, it's different. And so we have to kind of be careful that we don't say, just do this when things are different in different places, but learning from each other and sharing and getting all these groups working together, I think is the best thing. And I think it's happening.
Sure. And to Brit's point, there is a class action suit here in New York. I don't have very much I have information on it. Not I can't recall, but I can share it with anyone who is interested in learning more about how to go that route, if that feels relevant to you in your state.
Thanks so much. I see that Michael Dover has a question.
Good evening, everyone. Michael Dover here in Cleveland. So glad to hear that radical social workers are organizing. And, organizing is great. We can organize and make demands, or like Steve suggested, come up with asks, and we can place demands at the state level. But I wanted to see what people thought about remember what Pogo said, we have met the enemy and it is us. We are sort of saying that the enemy is these tests. And later on, I'll post an analysis I've done of the test that it proves exactly what some of those people have been saying. These are clinical tests. Even the advanced generalist test is a clinical test. They're playing a shell game with us. Don't get me started. I'm furious about the whole situation. Too many students heartbroken by this. Okay, but what kind of power analysis can we do in terms of how we could change our profession so that we had the power to truly change? Because my wife in here, she's a speech pathologist. They've taken speech pathologists and audiologists, if you wanted to say like the equivalent of clinicians and macro practitioners, they've united on behalf of people with communication disorders. They have one united profession. They control their own licensure tests. All 50 states use their test. Okay, we have CSWE, NASW, SWR, BPD, and ASWP, which is a creature of the governors, and historically has been overly influenced by the Southern slave owning states. I know because I was in New Orleans for 5 years and I saw what was going on. Okay. And, you know, we have a racist system. We always have. We need to change it. But we need the power to do that. You know, and could we do more if we truly united and had one professional association with like we promised to do, until all of the elitists and social work said, oh, let's go over and start an academy. We can all nominate ourselves. Or let's have 5 different conferences that no one can afford to go to, and we have hardly any students or practitioners there. You know, in sociology, we're fighting elitism. Maybe we need to fight elitism in social work. Unite, insist, demand unity. My question to you is, if we had a united professional association with a research division and a social work education division and a semi-autonomous accreditation division, you know, and a clinical division and a macro practitioners division, would we have the power to truly change things at the national level? And why don't we consider, you know, meanwhile, as long as we have what the former dean at Chicago calls churning, there'll be plenty of more demands for students in our schools. So us cast, the social work education cast, will have plenty of demand for our services. But meanwhile, the social workers are suffering. You know, so what can we do to have more power as a profession? And would unity help us, is my question on that. And how could that help us solve the licensure dilemma we're discussing?
I totally agree with you. I don't know how it would happen. No, I know they've tried a couple of times, wingspan, and get everybody together, and it falls because everybody wants to have their own organization. I don't know if anyone else has an idea on this.
At some point I devised with a very close colleague of mine, Tasha Pasternak, we devised an organization called Swoon. It was a labor justice organization for social workers and social service workers. The problem that we have for uniting as a field is that many social workers who are disenfranchised or dissatisfied with the fields slip out of the field and into private practice. And that has historically been, you know, the out that we have, that social workers have, so that they're not continuing to experience these disparities, these discrepancies, the uncertainty, and I would say, I don't want to say like the discomfort, the dissatisfaction of working in nonprofit and working within the community. And so that's why historically it's been very difficult to unite and also unionize so that we can speak from one voice. And so that's something that I've been thinking a lot about, because within this labor justice collective, we were really focused on unionization, but it's really hard because folks graduate from social work school, they have nonprofit jobs, and then once they get their C's here in New York, you never hear from them again. And that's a turnover of 3 years, and it takes longer than 3 years to unionize a profession. So it was very challenging from that perspective. And it is in this field specifically. Nurses and teachers don't have the private practice outlet. They work in the field for the most part. And so that is something that has come up over and over when attempting to think about how can we collectively make change within the profession, is that we see people in the profession for about 3 years here in New York, and then you never hear from them again. They're really active for those 3 years, and then private practice and Alma and Headway and that's the trajectory for a lot of social workers. So when I teach social work, I always say social work is not therapy. Social work is a problem-solving process, and therapy is one method of using that problem-solving process. I love social work as a community worker, but we don't always see other people who are so engaged and invested in the community. And if you have other responsibilities on top of labor, it makes it more and more difficult Yeah.
I just wanted to add, thank you, Mr. Dover, when you were speaking about power. It brought me back to my days at in graduate school at Temple University. Dr. Thaddeus Mathis Emeritus would talk on and on about all the dimensions of power, and it blew my mind, and it was wonderful. Yeah, I mean, and what Sunny was saying also, it's part of the problem also, the beauty and the problem, right? We are such a diverse profession. We are everywhere. We do everything. And so to unionize when you're everywhere doing everything with all kinds of competing financial needs, and your income is coming from one source and you have your student loans breathing on your neck on the other. I don't know the answer to that. I do believe that unity is key. There's always power in numbers, and getting your message to the floor is one of the biggest issues in power. So more of us all singing the same chorus, of course, would lend to that effort. But this is beyond me. But I thank you for that. It was very stimulating.
So much, Karen. I see Steve Burkhart, you have your hand raised. And you're muted if you have begun speaking, just so you know.
Yeah, that'll be easier without being muted. Yeah, I think we've got to work on two sets of things at the same time. One, what Jackie Mondros and what Brit are saying is one truth, and Sunny, which is to work locally in a variety of ways based on the extant conditions of different states and locales and where things are. I think that that's got to happen because base building has got to occur. So, and I think that is happening, but people have to be willing to link each other. The other truth, the both and is, as we work locally, we've got to tell the truth about what's happening nationally. And what's happening nationally is there's been a corruption at so many levels. Don't forget, it's not just that they lie. It's not just that the scores were racist. It was that they lied and said they didn't have the data. That's corruption. We have, the social worker equity campaign that many of you know we've been involved in. We have put out something related to that, that initially created the idea that we would have real reform within that. The National Code of Ethics Committee made a statement that there have been no substantive changes offered for the delegate assembly in 2023. That's a lie. That's corruption. So there are many things. So there's a hollowness at this moment in time nationally. If you look at the payment for placement, courage of the students leading these campaigns to change the ways in which schools of social work operate, they're speaking to a corruption that's going on in the type of education they're getting. We have to be willing to unify, do our individual work at local levels, like Brit and Jackie and others have been saying, and simultaneously we have to figure out a way, mechanisms that connect us nationally to tell the truth, to hold their feet to the fire with an ask. We can't simply say they're bad. That's easy. We've now proven that. So what? They don't have to listen. What we have to do is hold their feet to the fire. What's the unifying ask that speaks to the hollowness that's been out there and the alternative that lives in the room with people like Karen and people that Gareth knows, and then Michael that you speak to related to other people, that Pilar, who hasn't spoken at all, but I know is living this as a student and as an activist. We have to champion them as the alternative to the vision of what social work can be. We can't choose the dilemma of, oh, this is all terrible, therefore I go home. We have to say, I'm going to do locally what I can. And simultaneously, we have to be willing to unite nationally to tell the truth with a unifying ask. And our work ahead is to figure out what that ask is.
Anybody have anything else to add? Okay, well, excellent. I think that speaking about organizing and advocacy is a good transition to the next question. A study by Dr. Linda Plitt Donaldson actually found that among faculty surveyed, 88% agreed or strongly agreed that the majority of MSW students in their programs were interested in clinical practice over micro practice. That's a huge majority. Also, 59% agreed or strongly agreed that students felt that there was an emphasis on clinical social work practice in their various social work programs over the macro route. And so as a macro focused student myself, I can relate to those findings personally. It seems that there's an apparent imbalance between the macro and micro practice in our profession, and these low numbers of students being trained as macro social workers, those are the ones who end up being the advocates, being the community organizers and the planners and the policy analysts and the policy drafters. And it's clear that it somewhat creates inequity within the field in terms of where the programs place their focus. And so it almost seems as though macro students are another group that might be considered underserved. And so my question is regarding macro students, how do these licensing issues relate to the idea of having and obtaining and maintaining a micro license? Does anybody want to speak to that?
Well, I think that's what I was talking about before. And there's a lot of us who've been, talking about this for a while, is that no matter what anyone says, the tests just aren't related to macro social work. And I can't remember who said they analyzed the test and found that, but I think even ASWB says that there's not there's a small percentage, and it's probably even smaller. So that's the question: why are we making macro practice, community practice social workers get a license, and they feel like they have to get a job? So, talking about what Cheryl was saying about the liberal order, that they're feeling, they're feeling more like they have to do it now. So it's, and we're sort of pushing it, I know, but then as the director of a large program, our students want to be licensed too, so they will, I can spout off you don't need to, buck the trend, do what you want, but they want to graduate and get a job and be able to support themselves and pay off their student loans. And so we're putting them in this situation that they have to, take differential diagnosis or whatever it's called at the different schools in order to pass the test, or to hire Gareth or some of the other folks on this call who do ASWB licensure tests to be a practicing macro social worker. And it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. The macro license is the alternative, and I don't know if that makes a whole lot of sense.
Thank you so much, Liz. Cheryl, I see your hand.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think one of the biggest disservices we do to folks that go into clinical practice is we over-focus on how to interview, how to do a case note, but we don't pay any attention to the environment within which you're working. And then they get into these agencies that are, resource starved, and they suddenly have 30 to 40 clients, and they're doing paperwork on the weekends and having labor extracted from them for all sorts of stuff that it's I think one of the things that we need to do, and I'm not a huge believer in trying to work within CSWE. My forehead got bloodied plenty of times banging on that wall in the 80s and 90s. But I do think that we need to put sort of pressure in various places on a more holistic education for our students to prepare them for going in, you know, to the kind of practice they're going into, and to have an analytical framework that allows them to see that it isn't poor time management skills or you're not engaging in enough self-care, which seems to be NASW's solution. Rather, it's exploitative working conditions. And my experience has been is that once students as well as fairly new practitioners understand that, they're ready to roll. And the folks that are joining things like the Social Work Equity Campaign and SWA and some other groups, they're young clinicians who are just done with all this. So I think there is a real moment to do some unifying work across what is, I think, a very, you know, false divide. And I say that as a longtime community organizer who wouldn't be anywhere without sort of some clinical skills that I picked up along the way. So, you know, I think it's great people sort of front burner certain things, but I also think we've got to see where the connections are. And one of the connections, I think Jackie said it earlier, is what is happening to this workforce. And it's just not what people signed up for. That wasn't a question. That was just me, you know, going on. So.
And Deb, it looks like you have your hand raised.
Yeah, thank you. I absolutely agree. We need to do away with or fight the isms as much as we can. And that's hard. That's really, really hard. And I don't think we have to have an exam necessarily, but Sunny was saying, and I have met social workers that I didn't think should be social workers. We've all met a few. I think there are tons of great social workers out there, but we've all met a few that we were like, no. And I get a little uneasy when we kind of take on this attitude of, well, if you want to be a social worker, you can be a social worker. And there's no, I don't want to use the word gatekeeping because that has a really bad connotation, but there's no, if we do away with licensure, I just don't know what the answer is. That notion of, are you good at building relationships? Are you congruent with the code of ethics? Do you see what I'm saying? I don't know. I don't know what the answer is, but I think there has to be something. I'm worried about education because I'm an MSW program director, and I see the pressures to graduate large number of students. I mean, I don't know if other people have that at their universities, but we do where I'm at. And so there's issues there. And I'm just curious if anybody has any similar thoughts, or if I'm just kind of like, I don't know, out here on a limb by myself. Thanks.
I think my issue about gatekeeping is that we tend to focus on, it was the first thing I noticed when I came back to social work, that gatekeeping tended to be gatekeeping people with disabilities out of the profession, people with mental health issues, people with other issues. And I think that social work has a huge problem about disability discrimination. A lot of people still think is okay that we can, and how are we going to not do that if we have some sort of test, I don't know what it would be, like we're going to see if think they can have a relationship the way we think a relationship should be, or talk the way we think they should talk. I think it's similar with other cultures. That's why I'm skeptical of instituting something else that has a gatekeeping function. So I have a reaction to gatekeeping, but I understand the same thing about, afraid that we're putting out graduating folks who, and that's probably the school's fault. And I with you on that. Like, you know, what do we do when we've got a student who we think they shouldn't be a social worker? Then why are we graduating them? But they're saying if you don't graduate them, then your program won't get any money. Or, you know, it's a dilemma there. But I worry about gatekeeping, and I hated the term and hated the concept, even though I get the intent.
Sure. And there's also gatekeeping just to get into high school, get into college, get into grad school, at every level, get a job. There's gatekeeping at every level. But I do think that from what I've seen, from what I don't work in academic administration, but a school's responsibility is to make sure that to graduate students who can do the academic work. And that's not necessarily the case for whether they can do the practice work, you know? And there are plenty of people who graduate with flying colors from graduate school. There are plenty of people who can't graduate from a graduate school who have really great innate empathic skills and relationship building skills and community skills. We need to make sure that we're able to, Jackie just said in the comments, bridges, not gates. We're to offer those bridges to usher those social workers who have those skills into the field. I'm not totally convinced that the field is weeding out bad social workers. Maybe that's not my cross to bear. And also, I respect the profession, and I want to hold the profession up to, I want it to have integrity, and I would love to hear what everyone else has to say about that.
I don't know, like the thing that's coming up for me is it's a little bit of like policing. It's a lot of the language I'm hearing, like, and I don't know. I hear like the underlying need is we want to make sure that people that we're serving are safe and they're getting good care, and I definitely believe in that. I think we've got to. I think my sense is like what I'm taking away from a lot of this conversation is like we need to really be mindful about when we're getting sucked into these larger systems, and we need to kind of be really self-critical and say like, all right, this is, you know, what are we doing here? Like, are we okay with this? And if not, like, what are we okay with? Like, how do we like have integrity around this stuff? Because, you know, I just think, you know, I'm thinking about, you know, just more like taking more of a restorative justice approach and kind of having models that if someone's messing up, if someone's making mistakes, that we're able to like, we have a system for how to engage that and how to talk about it. And if they're causing harm, then we have conversations about that. And if they're not able to take those steps that like the person they're harming is asking for, then yeah, then they're not going to be able to continue to kind of do this work. But I don't know, there's something kind of just, this is making me uncomfortable, like some of the language. Like I also don't feel like it's my job to like be on the lookout for like social work. I don't know, like if I'm supervising someone who's struggling, I'm going to have a conversation with them, we're going to talk about it. Or if someone is approaching me, like then I want to hear that feedback. But I think that we need to just be really mindful of like what sort of agenda what that's about for us, and like and I think we need to keep having conversations about it. I'm not sure if there's like a one size fits all approach in some ways. I just wanted to speak to the comment about like the macro versus micro, in the sense that like I really just resonated with like it's a false dichotomy, and like I think of myself as I do a lot of like clinical work, but that clinical work informs like the macro work, right? So I'm working in Chicago around this campaign called Treatment Not Trauma, right? And we believe that we need someone besides calling 911 and having the police to show up, if someone's having a mental health crisis. Like fundamentally, that's what we need in our city, because people have died just because they're having a mental health crisis, and that's absolutely not okay. But like, it's through these conversations, it's through doing therapy, it's through doing that work, it's through those relationships that I'm hearing people say, like, yeah, like, it's when, don't call the cops. Like, I don't like, I'm okay. Yeah, I'm having suicidal thoughts, but I don't need to be hospitalized. I don't want the cops to show up, you know? And so, but we need something else. We can't just, right now, we don't have anything else in the city, right? And so, and then my experience advocating then comes back to, like, you know, if a client is really struggling with something, right? And so I think we just need to really, I really support the idea of, like, coming back to the educational process and thinking about how do we integrate these things in a way that's not so like all or nothing or either or, but that it's really like, this is, you know, this is how you see it. This is one way to see an organization. Like, do it, like, here's an analysis of power in an organization, and here's how to, if something is dysfunctional, here's some things you can do, right, to make sure that, like, the organization isn't causing harm, right, and that you have integrity working for this organization, and how to, like, kind of, so I just think that I think that I don't know as much about licensure, but I think just the way that we're teaching social work, it would really be helpful if, like, it's more integrated, because that was definitely not a part of my education. I just kind of come by it and sought it out. But I work with a lot of people, like a lot of white social workers, who I'm constantly kind of engaging and sort of encouraging them to, like, take action around these things, and not just to kind of accept the status quo, but to really, like, live out anti-racist values in doing this work. And so I just think that would be so much easier if people had that foundational knowledge that, like, this is part of your job. Like, thinking about systems is part of your job. Like, yeah, so that's all in there.
Oh, go ahead, Karen.
Oh, yeah, there's a couple of things. Yeah, I wasn't sure. I was feeling like anxiety, I guess, while I was listening to some, I don't know. I think, like, the feelings I was getting is about, yeah, a bad social worker. I mean, right? We all had, like, a really terrible day, and it just piled on. And you just caught me at the wrong time, you know, and I snapped, right? That's a moment in time, and yeah, my supervisor will address it, and we will figure out a way that that won't happen again. So that's what I'm kind of thinking, like, kind of goes along with those sort of things, right? Even if somebody's coming from a different discipline, right? Because that still occurs. There are people who, you know, psych backgrounds or what have you, are in a social worker role. But yet that doesn't mean they're being a bad social worker. Right. And, you know, I've been doing it for so long. And I hope that just because I just am not really able at this time to pass this test, that doesn't equate me to not being, you know, as good of a, you know, as someone who has been able to do it. And when I do, eventually, if I ever do pass the test, it doesn't mean I'm suddenly going to be more brilliant than I was ever before. So there's that. Oh, and then yes, the macro micro piece. Yeah, I was one of those macro people. It was called a social administration or planning and social administration, something like that. They've changed it since then, I believe. But yeah, no, I really had, I think I recall maybe one or two questions that popped up that were more macro. And I remember going in thinking, oh, well, at least I have my statistics down so they can ask me all of that. Well, they didn't give me any of those. So yeah, it's a real problem. And I also, and I know students really don't want to have a third year, but I also kind of felt gypped that I had to declare. Like, I had to choose if I was going to go the clinical track or the macro track. I was like, but I'm interested in family therapy too, you know. And I think it would have enhanced things along the way. But just wanted to throw that out there as well.
I want to say when looking at all of the complaints in one state for however many years, I think it was 15 years, the bad social workers were not someone having a bad day. They tend to be the people who were brought, who were getting called for grievances. They're either sleeping with their clients or stealing their money. That's like almost all of them were we're doing those two things. And that's who we're calling the board on. It's not about, are they good at making relationships with people? Like anything we're talking about that we think licensing has anything to do with, that's not what licensing is even about. It's not about whether you're a good social worker. It's about protecting the public from social workers doing fraud against them and stealing their money, or, you know, doing that kind of stuff. And that's, and it's not even a little bit of harm, it's a lot of harm. And like I did, you know, I didn't see any macro related things at all, nothing about that. And there wasn't a lack of and the main thing was that you didn't pay your bills on time and you didn't do your CEUs on time, and that was the most important thing for the licensure board. You know, so you know, that's why I don't think it's as, you know, when we think about it as protecting the public, licensure wasn't designed initially to prove who was a good social worker or who had good social work skills. It was to protect the public from harm. So, you know, we have to, that's why I was saying at the beginning, I think we need to be careful that we're not equating the license with some sort of stamp of good practice. And I think we get that way when we start getting, well, we need to show this way, we need to do that. And I don't know if we need to do that at all.
I do just want to say thank you so much for all of your comments. I do want to say that in my brevity, just as using the term bad, what I have meant is social workers who are doing harm repeatedly, social workers who are abusing power repeatedly, social workers who act immorally, unethically, illegally, repeatedly. And so that's what I'm referring to. I'm not referring to, I'm so sorry for if I was misconstrued or misunderstood, but thank you for the moment to self-evaluate and reflect on my language.
I think that Molly Greenberg had her hand raised. Molly, do you have something to add?
I did, and I appreciate, I guess, the conversation. Been a little back and forth of whether or not I want to add vocally into the space or remain in the chat, which sometimes feels like a little bit of a safer space. I'll at least say I'm a macro, I guess, as folks here would define, I'm a macro social worker who has never gone near a license at any point, and I've been doing this work for about 15 years or so. And I've struggled at times with being part of the social work profession because there doesn't always feel like there's space for the kind of macro work. So either you're a licensed or you're not, you're a micro or you're macro. You have to go through this, you're a professional when you go through your license and you become a micro social worker or a clinical social worker. But clinical social workers can enter my field or feel that they have the training. I'm 15 years in the field. To enter my field without any external training or grounding or understanding of what it means to do the kind of community work. And so it's only within the past couple of years you've kind of even heard of space to have these discussions. And I'm not going to sit here and say I know all the answers, and I will actually hit enter to the thing I was going to put in the chat. So I'm not sure if that helps with a general question, but I do think that those are just my own general reflections and thoughts that I have as being, you know, my own positionality in the discussion.
Yeah. And Teresa, I see your hand is raised.
Yeah, and I just want to thank you all for this discussion. I feel like it's really led into this question well. But what can like generalist and advanced generalist programs or like even non-track programs add to this discussion around licensing? I graduated both my bachelor's and master's from those programs and both emphasized rurality. And so what kind of focus do you think potentially moving forward, licensure could have on just everybody needs to know everything versus track the license. So only macro, only micro.
I'm sorry, does anybody want to speak to that?
Can you say what the question was again? I was thinking about advanced generalists, but about how they like what you're wanting to think about in more depth.
Yeah, so like I know in my state, there's no option for taking the advanced generalist and becoming licensed, at least through the exams. And so as far as like moving forward about creating a space that kind of all social workers have learned and can demonstrate that they have the skills to kind of work across various levels, especially when thinking of the rural nature of a lot of social workers as well.
I can just like tangentially answer that. I mean, I think there's some states that have that kind of license and other states that don't, you know, so I came from a state where they had that generalist, advanced generalist license. And it was supposed to be equal to that of the clinical license, but in the field, in reality, people thought of the clinical license as superior to the advanced generalist license. And it was a problem. Now, some places don't have it at all, you know, that they just have a graduate license. You know, and so that's if, you know, I think states could go down the line of having more licenses if they were going in that direction, or limiting the licenses. But that's one of the sort of highlights the issues with licensing, that we have, you know, so many different, every state has different types of licenses. They call them different. They've been working on license portability for, you know, they were just coming to license portability when they finally released the data about how racist the tests were. And we're not sure what's going to happen with that. Now it's sort of on pause right now. So yeah, it's a big mess. So I don't really have a whole lot to answer. I don't know if anyone else knows more about this.
Yeah.
Thanks. I also wanted to apologize to Karen because I used the word bad social workers too. And I agree totally with what Sunny said about that. I didn't mean people that had a bad day. I didn't mean, unfortunately, there are a few, I don't think it's the majority, who aren't doing ethical, moral social work. And that's who I'm talking about. So I just had to say that. So, and the other thing I want to say is it's fantastic that people who receive services from social workers have the ability to lodge complaints, and they should. That's great. But a lot of people don't know what a legitimate, moral, ethical social worker should be doing, right? So it can't all be on complaints from people. I don't think that's going to be the answer either. That's a part of it, but not the whole answer. So I don't have any answers about this. I'm just throwing out there that, you know, things we need to think about. But thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Deb. And thank you so much for our panelists. I have truly appreciated your contributions to this conversation, and I'm sure everybody feels the same who has tuned in today. I think, Cheryl, would you like to make some closing remarks at this time?
No, I want to just say on behalf of, you know, ACOSA and the social work equity campaign, that, you know, what a privilege it was to sit in and hear these different perspectives. You know, we don't create these spaces, I think, often enough. And if there's one thing the pandemic gave us, it's Zoom competency. So we're all licensured in Zooming, if nothing else. We will be posting this recording on the ACOSA website, and if I can figure out how to do it, I will be sending an email out to everybody who registered. I would also encourage you to look at a number of different organizations, ACOSA, the Pay Equity Campaign, Payments for Placements, and there were some other ones dropped in the chat. I think there's some really good, exciting, creative movement happening at the agency and grassroots levels. And I look forward to sort of partnering with folks around that. So I want to really thank the panelists for their very thoughtful contributions. I want to thank Kat, who is the moderator of choice for all ACOSA activities. So if you have a moderating need, please, we will make Kat available. Deb, do you want to say a closing thing as well from the LEAD committee?
Yeah, I just want to echo what everybody's people said. Thank you to all the guest speakers. Thank you to Kat for doing a wonderful job moderating. Thank you to ACOSA, to the Social Worker Equity Campaign. And I think I also mentioned, and I want to thank all the people on the LEAD subcommittee because they did a lot of hard work on this. So I hope it was food for thought for all of us. And I think, and I hope it will help lead into some action. So thank you, everybody.
Right. Stay tuned for the action. Okay. Any final comments from the panelists?
I would just say find a way to plug in, because there's a heck of a lot of work to be done. And I think to the point about relationships, we need one another to really break these barriers down and to build community. It's so much easier when we're swimming upstream together. So please keep in touch. Good to meet you all.
Great. Thank you so much. So I'm going to bring this to an end. Good night, everybody.